of time and everybody's schedule, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for stopping in. This is really a tutorial. I call it the ABCs of energy policy. It's really a very broad brush approach to a lot of the factors that go into making energy policy, affecting energy policy. Those of you who are specialists in any one area may find my very high-level description overly simplistic, and if you have comments or corrections or questions as we go, we've got the whole session, so we have plenty of time. So I'd like to kind of ask the questions as we go. If you think there's something that's not clear, here's a lot of material. And if you find that you're here and you already know this, feel free to come and go. I won't be offended. So let's get started. Get this going. Okay, so really I'm going to go A, B, C all the way through the alphabet, and each letter is going to have a lot of content. So as I said, we'll just move through, and if you have questions along the way, feel free to stop me at any time, or if you have clarifications or anything, just, again, feel free to stop me as we go. So one of the most important components of energy policy is the accessibility, and that is site access. We have heard some discussions here about the public versus private land ownership, the volume of land in Alaska that's owned federally. This leads to different leasing issues. It's much easier in most cases to do leasing on private land than it is on public land. Unless you live in a state like Colorado, where I live, where you have a split estate, where the surface owner owns the surface and the minerals are owned by somebody else. So then you have two people that you have to negotiate with. Because we have a push in many states for renewable energy, many states have developed these competitive renewable energy zones, and that is an attempt to concentrate where the renewables will be developed so that you can build transmission to those specific zones. So there's a little bit of a quid pro quo there, that if I'm a renewable energy developer, I have to work within the bounds of that competitive renewable energy zone. And if I really want my project to go ahead, the benefit of that is that I will likely have easier access to transmission, but I give up the right to go 10 miles down the road. But it's an attempt to link the large-scale renewables to the markets with transmission access. And here, that really goes with this. Yes?
Do shut me down if I ask too many questions.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's a countrywide wind study to identify the best areas where wind renewables can be sited. Is it synced up with this?
The competitive renewable energy zones are really usually state by state. So I do have a wind map later that will show. But California, for instance, has a very large renewable energy transmission initiative where they did a big study. Where are these CREZ, where are these zones best suited, and how are we going to get the transmission to them? So the transmission access, if you have a large-scale wind farm or a large-scale solar farm, but you can't get that electricity to market, the transmission access is another huge angle on accessibility. That's really for large-scale, utility-scale generators. At the more local level is the distribution access. And this is really related to distributed on-site generation. If I can't get an interconnection to my local utility, I'm going to have problems building an on-site generator, a distributed generator. And this has been a huge issue for distributed generation because basically the utilities hold all the cards and they can make that very difficult for you. So in terms of policy, that has been one of the most contentious issues, and where the regulators have really had to step in and say, you will provide interconnection for this distributed generation, because if you can't get connected, you can't build your project. And then, of course, what I've called emissions access. If you have a fossil fuel generator, in most, well, I won't say most, in many areas, you have to have an underlying permit to emit criteria pollutants, and in some states now, such as California, for CO2. So the accessibility is huge. This is just to extend the private versus public aspect of accessibility. This map shows all of the federal ownership across the country. And you can see there's many different colors because there are many different federal agencies that have land ownership. You can't really read these down here, but we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So if you're, here's the Navajo Nation, here's the Utes. So that would be the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Bureau of Land Management is huge in the West. Bureau of Reclamation would be the large dams, so Hoover Dam down here. I don't remember what these all are. The Department of Defense is the purple. And we've got the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, Tennessee Valley Authority, and the other categories. So we've heard in many of the plenary sessions about how little private land ownership there is in Alaska. And so I would say that most of what's white here is probably the state ownership. There is some private ownership. This is an interesting map that I like that shows within each state how much of that state's landmass is owned by the federal government. So it's a huge issue. On this map, it's a little bit different. This is showing where the major shale plays are in the lower 48 states. And I think it's very significant if you overlay that map with this map, you'll see why shale gas production on private land has really dominated the energy picture. Because particularly here in the Marcellus or down in Texas, and Haynesville and Barnett, all of that's predominantly private land. So we have seen since 2007, private production on oil and gas production on private land has gone up significantly, and similarly on federal lands has gone down. So the accessibility issue is really key. If you can't get access to your resource, it won't be produced. So that's really dealing with the upstream. How do we get it produced? And at the very downstream end is how do we recover all the costs associated with that? Now this is just a standard, this is my utility bill from a while back, summer utility bill. This is a residential case where I just pay for what I use. And this is kind of the standard setup. I have a meter, the utility, in my case a rural electric co-op, provides me with electrons, spins my meter, and I pay them at the end of the month. So it's very simple flow. I don't have any on-site generation, so my on-site generation is less than what I use. This will be important in some of the other billing types that we'll see coming up. Anyway, very simple. My bill basically bills me for my kilowatt hours, and then I do have a base charge. Base charge is very common, and ours is actually more than doubled with the new rates, which is basically the charge that the utility charges me just for providing me access to their grid. So it's really a fixed fee. They've tried to justify the doubling of the base charge. It hasn't gone over very well. In our co-op, we can pay extra to have a certain portion of our kilowatt hours coming from renewables. And that goes into a local renewable fund. We pay our taxes. And then they have what I think is very clever. It's called Roundup. And basically you can volunteer to round up your bill to the nearest dollar. And in this case, we paid an extra 90 cents. And then they use that within the community as a kind of charitable contribution. So that's really the simplest type of billing. And then the question comes, well, how do you set those rates? And cost of service regulation is a big shaggy dog story, and as I said, if that's what you do for a living, you may take exception to how I've simplified it here, but essentially if you are establishing cost of service rates, it's very similar regardless of whether you're at the local level, for a municipality, at the state level, at the federal level. The basic construction is similar, the devil is in the details. So the very first, and I liken it to making pizza, because I think it kind of covers all of the pieces, no pun intended. The very first piece is, what is the revenue requirement? How much revenue does a utility need to cover all of its costs? And that would include an acceptable rate of return on its investments. And so I liken this to, how big a pizza do we need? That's the very first thing that you have to determine. And once you have determined through a very litigious process, lots of interveners, the utility comes in, files a rate case with about a foot of paper. You've got to go through and find the P, find where the skeletons are hidden, if you will. But in the end, the first step you have to do is decide how much money does the utility need to provide the service that we all want. And then the second step is allocating all of those costs. You've got all the costs associated with capital, you've got O&M costs, you've got fixed costs, you've got variable costs. And so the question is, which of those costs go into which bucket, into which service, for instance. And so I just liken that to, so how are we going to arrange all the ingredients on this pizza now that we know how big it is through our revenue requirement establishment. And then the last piece is really the rate design. And this is the creative piece. And it's really, okay, now we've got the pizza. We know what kind of pizza it is by how we've arranged the ingredients on. And now it's going to be who's going to get how big a slice of that pizza. And in one of my corporate positions, my job was to be at the table to make sure the company I was working for didn't get a bigger piece than it felt it was entitled to. Because you got to pay for every piece that you get. And so this rate design has a long, colorful history of, how once we know where all the costs go, then how are we going to put them into each of the rates? And depending on where you are, for instance, if you're a utility and you're building new generators, you build, because they come in chunks, you have to build ahead of your demand. How do you then encourage people to use that excess capacity that you have to consume more kilowatt hours? And then as you build into that, you're going to want to slow that down. And that all comes in the rate design. So that seems like it's very scientific, but once you get to the rate design part of it, it's really quite political almost. Yes?
I was wondering if many American utilities are still using cost of service regulation.
Yes, I think almost all of them would use it to some extent. We have different, as our loads have been, with energy efficiency and demand response, we have, in many cases, kind of flat load. And so you have this issue of stranded costs. Mm-hmm. And when you, for instance, have distributed generation, you lose load, and how can you kind of cover those costs among the rest of the system? So we have a lot of new, really rate design issues. They still have to recover all their costs. You still have to put the costs in buckets, but how can you de-link that so that we're not trying to encourage more usage? And that's, or it just slipped out of my mind. But that de-linkage of the costs from the rates is part of the process. But I think almost every utility still has some aspect of cost of service.
There is very, very few really incentive regulation in use.
Yes, I think the more the incentive regulation is really going towards demand response and energy efficiency, trying to provide incentives different than what we have done. So I think that, again, in the rate design, it's different because we're trying to provide incentives to do things differently. Mm-hmm. But I think it's all within still the same basic cost of service structure. It's just we're rethinking how we want to design the rates to provide what incentives. Thank you, that's a good question. Okay, so one of the ways that we are trying to change how we look at our utilities is by demand response. In the past, most of our incentives have been on the supply side, build more generation to meet the load. We've realized over the years that the load is not absolutely fixed, that there is an ability for load to move between time periods, and that would be the energy shifting. And that may be as simple as having a large university campus may have thermal energy storage, that they may be charging at night, cooling down a chilled water tank at night, using the off-peak electricity that is typically at a much lower rate, and then they use that chilled water during the peak of the day, so that they are actually both energy shifting and shaving how much energy they're using on the peak. And to the extent that you can do that in large numbers, you can actually reduce the need, because it's really the peak that we have to build for. You can reduce the need to build generators, particularly peaking generators. So demand response has become a huge movement, really. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has provided rulings on how this needs to be paid for, but it has had a huge impact to the point that I have a friend in Pennsylvania who is getting $60 a month credit on his electric bill to give the utility the right to turn off his air conditioner at will. And I think most people's experience is that you give that right and you don't even know when it's happening, because the utility doesn't want you to be uncomfortable. They want you to participate in that program. So they were initially getting $60 a month, and the program proved so popular that they had gotten notice that that rate was going to be cut in half, because so many people, it's basically free money, and particularly if you are working all day and not at home, what do you care if your temperature goes up a degree or two? So that's the type of programs that there are under demand response, and this has proven to be just a really popular and as a better way to avoid having to build new peaking units. I just want to talk a little bit about the graph that's behind this. This is a graph done for an analysis on the impacts of integrating renewables, and this is specifically for California, and this is an extreme case. I think this is the 40% renewables. I just wanted to call your attention, because we'll talk about it a little bit later, to the different kind of tranches of generation. And we all have the base load, maybe nuclear, maybe coal. They want to run flat all the time. So they are below where our load is up here. So they run pretty much flat all the time. Then we have I don't think you can even see the geothermal because it's not a very large slice. Then you have what's called the load following. And these are the guys that move but not instantaneously. And in California, you use a lot of hydro very dynamically to balance load. They have a lot of pumped hydro. And then you've got your peakers, and you can see even with a lot of wind and solar, which is this purple, you still have to have your peakers running, because they've got to be managing the intermittency of the load of the wind and solar. So in order to meet your energy requirements for the renewable portfolio standards, you end up having more capacity than you can necessarily need at the peak times. And so these red areas are areas where you actually had more renewable generation than you could handle, and you had to curtail. You had to turn your wind turbines off, for instance. So I just wanted to provide that as background, because it'll come into play in some of our other slides. Okay. So you hear about demand response, and we hear a lot about energy efficiency. And a lot of people say, so what's the difference? They both have the same kind of impact in that they're reducing load. And the difference is that demand response is temporary. It's dynamic and temporary, and energy efficiency is permanent. That's really the simple answer. So this is just a laundry list of things you can do to reduce energy at home. Through energy efficiency. And again, energy efficiency is permanent, but the concept is that you get the same service using less energy. So one kind of classic is replace your incandescent bulbs with compact fluorescents, or preferably LEDs, because you're still going to have the same, people would say the same light. I think it's getting better. Compact fluorescents, the early ones, I did not like the quality of the light, but that is getting better. But you still have the lights, the lumens. So just, simple things that you can do. I won't go through all those. But that's the distinction between demand response and energy efficiency. And I didn't want to use energy efficiency for my E, because I wanted to include energy storage, which in my opinion is really the holy grail of the energy industry right now. As we move more and more towards increased penetration of renewable energy, because of the intermittency of those resources, because the sun only shines during the day, and if you get a cloud that comes over, you've got to have somebody that's willing to pick up the slack and able to pick up the slack. The wind tends to blow at night in most places, which is not really when we need it. If we can get large-scale energy storage, that will go a long way to our ability to increase the penetration of renewables on the grid system. And because it is really the holy grail, there is a whole development of technologies for storage. One of the most mature is this pumped hydro. And this, of course, you have to live in an area where you have water. California has a lot of pumped hydro. They basically pump the water up into an upper reservoir at night during, again, low energy use, low electricity prices. And then they allow that upper reservoir to spill down into the lower reservoir during the day, during the peak periods. And that can be operated very dynamically. Other ones that we're all familiar with, the lead acid battery that's in your car, that can be, you can create banks of those. Compressed air energy storage has been developed on a commercial basis. It's still quite expensive. Basically, you have a big cavern in the ground, usually typically in the ground. You use low-cost electricity during the low-demand hours to pump air into that cavern to compress it, and then during the higher energy prices, you release that through a turbine and generate electricity. Molten salt is another kind of fascinating one to me that you use, for instance, with large-scale solar plants. It allows you, if you can be charging your molten salt, and that's basically heating it during the peak, perhaps you're not using all of your solar production, you can heat molten salt, and that allows you to extend particularly your generation from your project into the evening hours after the sun has gone down, which is when most of us get home from work and turn on all of our electrical appliances, etc. So that allows a little bit of dispatchability for a large-scale solar plant. And then we have a bunch of demonstration technologies, flow batteries, which, as the name would imply, instead of charging and discharging, as in most batteries, they flow as long as you have the right ingredients. And it's all very high-tech chemistry that I won't be able to answer any questions about. Lithium-ion batteries, we've heard a lot about these with the Boeing Dreamliner, have a lot of promise, clearly probably have a lot of, that's why they're demonstration in most cases, and then flywheels, which is a rotational type of storage. And the thing with storage, there's probably room for almost all of the technologies. Yes?
And back on the other slide, something that we're doing here is using depleted gas fields, and we're filling them up in the summer when the demand is low, so we can have cheaper gas in the winter to heat our homes here when we have those peak demands in the winter. And so we're repurposing depleted gas fields.
Terrific,
Yeah.
terrific. And I had really focused, thank you, I had really focused on electricity here, but that's, yeah, natural gas storage, of course, is a critical component of the natural gas market, so thank you for that.